Ladies and gents, welcome to another episode of Optimize Your Body podcast. I've got a great guest on today. It's been a while since we've had a guest on, and we're kicking it back off with a bang with Dave Feldman here. And I found you through our friend, Dr. Filippo Vardia. I heard you on his show, and I found it really interesting, my man. We were just talking off air, right, Dave, that you live in Las Vegas, and you've been there since 2008.
That's correct. And it is the summer right now, so of course it gets a little bit hotter here. But I think I was always meant to live in a hotter climate because I always prefer the heat over the cold.
Got it, man. Yeah. By the way, half of my audience are actually in America, so they understand that. I've been to Vegas 3 times. I'm not going to go into that conversation, Dave, right? Because that's a story for another day. But I was back in my 20s and stuff, you know. But anyway, let's move on. But I found what your journey really fascinating, and I know it was back in 2015, right, Dave? You kind of discovered the low carb, high fat diet, and then you just went right down that rabbit hole then of testing out your lipids and being able to manipulate your cholesterol levels, all that kind of stuff by playing around with what you were eating. And that was obviously life changing for you, right? And took you on this journey.
Yeah, for those who don't already know, I'm actually an engineer. I had no interest in medicine and nutrition or anything along those lines, but I wanted to adopt a keto diet so I didn't become diabetic like much of my family. And it was working really well. However, my cholesterol shot through the roof and I became obsessed, started doing a number of self experiments. And through these experiments, found out that my engineering background kind of connected me a little bit because I guess you could say the system that moves cholesterol around in our body is much like a network. And so ultimately, that resulted in me kind of understanding it a lot through these experiments. And it's how we got to where we are here today. It's a bit of an involved story, no question.
That's incredible. That's incredible. No, I'd love to hear a little bit more about that story, though, and what got you kind of so obsessed with, because it is kind of obsessed. You do need to be obsessed to get to where you're at and how far you've taken it and actually impact so many people, really, right? And that's why we're here today. But what was it that I know you said your family struggled with, like you mentioned, diabetes and stuff, right? So was that the main kind of inspiration? And then was it also, this is not adding up, right? Because it just, a lot of it doesn't add up, does it? It's like, okay, my cholesterol's high. There's got to be more to this, though.
Yeah, it did. So this is the succession of things. April of 2015, I go on a keto diet, and my dad and my sister, who both are struggling with some medical conditions, my dad with type 2 diabetes and my sister also with hypertension, they got inspired by me starting and also went on a keto diet. They get their blood work before me 6 months later. So we're all starting around the same time. They get their blood work before me, and their cholesterol did go up a marginal amount, not hardly that much at all. And so I was comforted by that. I was going, oh, okay. So in our family, our genetics, I shouldn't actually see that much of a rise. And I was wrong. My cholesterol nearly doubled. And I became obsessed. That's what started the obsession was I thought, wait a sec, I have two first degree relatives who do not see this increase in their LDL cholesterol, the so-called bad cholesterol, but I do, and they would concede this. I'm a bit more metabolically healthy than they are. I was training for running at the time, and the keto diet was great for those 7 months of bliss where I didn't have my blood work, and I was like, oh, this is great. I'm actually setting personal records, and I'm doing great. And so I, for a period of time, I was in fear. Um, and I want to say the fear is entirely subsided, but as I started to learn more and more about how we're powered by fat, especially when we're metabolically healthy, I started to connect some dots that is now published. We'll get to that part of the story in a moment, but it's ultimately led me into effectively a linear move over to research itself from my engineering career. But this is, if you want, I can kind of get into, I guess you could say the layperson pitch for what this model is.
Love to hear it.
If
Yeah.
you're powered by fat, what we posit is that you need to move those around. They need to be carried in the blood. So we have a special protein complex that's a combination of lipids and protein, appropriately called a lipoprotein. And the body's kind of a genius in that it puts all of these lipids we need, not just the fat you're powered by, but also fat-soluble vitamins like A, D, E, and K, and yes, cholesterol as well. All of these don't mix well with water, and our blood is water-based. So it puts it in these boats, if you will, and then puts them in, and they become soluble in our bloodstream. And our body makes these lipoproteins to move them around to our cells. Well, if you're powered by fat, then you need to pull fat out of your fat cells and also put them back away again. That is what metabolism ultimately is. It's the building up of stuff and the breaking down of stuff, particularly fuel. And so if you're metabolically healthy, you need to traffic that fuel a lot, right? Well, in the case of if you're powered more by carbs, well, glucose, which is what carbs break down into, that's already soluble in the blood. So it doesn't need a carrier. But if you're powered by fat, that does. That needs these carriers, these lipoproteins. So sure enough, if you're lean, especially, and metabolically healthy, then you have a lot of fat coming out of your fat cells. And when it is, a lot of it gets picked up by the liver, which then repackages them into these lipoproteins. The VLDL is the one that comes from the liver. And that, after it drops off its cargo, its lipid cargo, becomes the very famous LDL. And so the cholesterol found on LDL particles, you could say, is ride sharing with the fat you're powered by if you're on a low carb diet. And that's basically the gist. It's this turnover, this very rapid turnover of the fat fuel coming off of these VLDL in the form of triglycerides being delivered rather rapidly, rather quickly. And when it is, it results in more of these LDL particles and therefore more LDL cholesterol. That's kind of the 50,000-foot view pitch.
Got it. Got it. And I want to get into more about just what cholesterol, how it acts in the body as a hormone, nutrient, all those kind of things. But you mentioned something before, which you touched on then, about cholesterol is a passenger, not a driver. And you mentioned then about boats, or we could use cars as the analogy or whatever to transport around. Give us a breakdown of what you mean by that, cholesterol being the passenger, not the driver.
Yeah, so cholesterol, if you're going to make these lipoproteins in the body, you actually need cholesterol to make them. They're literally part of the construct. You can't actually make these things without them. And that's kind of an important note because as you kind of alluded to, cholesterol is used in many different things throughout the body, not the least of which are cells themselves. They are literally part of what binds our cells together. And they're part of our nervous system. They are precursors to hormones. They help us digest food, all of these different things, right? But for transporting the lipids around our body, these boats, they need them too to construct them properly. So how it's a passenger is in the process of moving around these lipids that our body uses. A lot of the cholesterol that constructs those lipoproteins remain with that lipoprotein. So these VLDL that I talked about earlier, as I mentioned, they're carrying triglycerides, which were powered by much more on a low-carb, high-fat diet. And these triglycerides were getting powered by, but when it starts out, it's bloated with this cargo, particularly triglycerides and some cholesterol. As it drops off these triglycerides, then it doesn't drop off the cholesterol at the same proportion. Much of the cholesterol remains on board. That's why it's more of like a passenger. It remains with the boat as it's dropping it off. So if you were to kind of think of, to use the car analogy you brought up earlier, if you were to think of lipoproteins as kind of like Uber, and it starts off with a whole bunch of passengers, and the passengers are like triglycerides, and they get dropped off, then the driver is like the cholesterol, generally remains with the car after it's dropped it off.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So yeah, and let's talk about how, I guess let's get straight into the different types, right? So we mentioned VLDL, we've got LDL, we've got HDL, and they've been quoted good and bad cholesterols, right, over the years by who knows what's going on there. I know there's a lot more to it than that, but LDL is mixed. There's so many different variables, right? Is what I'm trying to say, Dave. There's so much context going on here, and you mentioned metabolic health, but you just tell us like how you would just explain to the audience again the different types of cholesterol in a nutshell, I know it's, again, there's small particles, there's all these different things, right? It's very complex, but just in a nutshell for the audience. And I'd love to know why you think they've been labeled, LDL is bad and HDL is good cholesterol.
Well, what that actually comes from is when we were first discovering cholesterol. In fact, when we were discovering that they were in these boats that I described, there was no distinction between the different types of boats. And so that was just when it was known as cholesterol, period. And any of these lipoproteins that were found, it was the addition of all of the cholesterol found in all of the boats together for a given unit of blood. So that was before it was understood. And then what happened is they had a device called a centrifuge where they could spin it really fast and it would divide them up based on different densities. And an LDL, what it actually breaks out as is low density lipoprotein. And so it would float at a different level than HDL, high density lipoprotein. What they found was that the cholesterol in the low density lipoprotein associated more with cardiovascular disease, and that actually the cholesterol found in the HDL, the high density lipoprotein, did the reverse, that the more cholesterol you had in HDL particles, those boats, the lower your cardiovascular disease independently. So this is where it gets kind of an important piece of nuance. It's worth knowing. The actual cholesterol esters in each of these boats, the cargo, they're the same molecule. It's literally the exact same molecule that's found in each. So when you hear LDL cholesterol, that's the bad cholesterol, it's actually not a kind of cholesterol. It's really cholesterol found in that kind of boat, right? It's an ApoB lipoprotein. And HDL cholesterol isn't different than LDL cholesterol, other than it's the cholesterol found in HDL particles. And so the one way to tie this up in a bow is that this process that I was just telling you about, the delivery process, where you're delivering these lipids, right? These VLDL are delivering these lipids into LDL. Well, in that course of that process, as the triglycerides get dropped off, they're taken up, and therefore this brings the amount of triglycerides found in like a snapshot of your blood down, which is comparable to glucose. If you're very healthy, if you're athletic, you might be on a high carb diet, but if you get a fasted blood test, your glucose levels will be low. Is that because you don't have a lot of carbs? No, it's because your body takes them up rather rapidly. It's the same thing with triglycerides off of VLDL. And now I bring it back to HDL. Here's what's interesting, is if triglycerides are low, generally HDL tends to be high. Why does it tend to be high? Because HDL particles, where they get their cholesterol, a lot of it is from this turnover, from this process of delivering the lipids to your cells in the periphery. When that delivery happens, HDL particles are nearby and they pick up a lot of those components in this turnover process. So that's why often you find with metabolic health, people have low triglycerides and also high HDL, but then also the reverse. If somebody has high triglycerides, they tend to have low HDL, suggesting that there's less of that turnover. There's less of the successful delivery into the periphery, which would result in higher HDL cholesterol.
Wow, that makes so much sense. You literally just answered what I was going to ask you, and you explained it in a way which I've never heard it before. That's so simple. But I was going to say, it seems everyone I know who's super healthy, like in our space, when they get their test, their LDL is a little bit high. And I got my blood test done recently. My LDL was a little bit elevated. And, the doctor was like, didn't really know what to say, right? Avoid eating fatty foods and stuff like that. Started giving me advice. And I didn't even get into that conversation. I was like, yeah, okay, cool. But I see that a lot, right? So that is, so my triglycerides were low. All my bloods were great, by the way. And my LDL was slightly elevated. And I have this battle so often, as you can imagine, with clients. I'm a coach, and they'll come to me and everything's going great. Metabolically, they're healthier than they've ever been. In other words, they've lost a lot of fat around their midsection in the shape of their life physically. Then they'll go to the doctors and their LDL might be a tiny bit high. And then I think one time a client went and the doctor said, okay, you need to cut out all meat, basically eat the plant-based diet. So then, you know what I mean? So I've had that battle with clients in the past, and it's a tough one, That's all I wanted to say. So I'm sure you've kind of, so with your bloods, give us an example. Do you notice that when you get your test? And again, it depends on how conclusive, sorry, how are you getting them done as well, the blood tests? You're getting them in the general doctors like I did, and you're being compared against, the average person, all that kind of stuff. But with your blood work, do you notice that your LDL is like a little bit, I don't know if you want to say high, but, in comparison to the norm or whatever the norm is your LDL normally a little bit high, or what would you say?
Oh yeah, well, my LDL is comparable to that first ketogenic test. So to give you a range, it's roughly between 250 and 270, which would be considered well into heterozygous FH territory. Sorry, FH being familial hypercholesterolemia. Bef Literally before keto became as big as it is now, it was very, very rare that you'd run into somebody who had LDL levels comparable to what I have right now, for example. LDL at those ranges is typically something that would be associated with this genetic disease, which also tends to associate with higher cardiovascular disease. So understandably, that's why I went down this rabbit hole. I was extremely concerned. And to reiterate what I said before, not that all of that concern has gone away, but that's exactly why I launched into the science, which we'll probably get into shortly. But the key question that you're asking is an important one, which is if you get more metabolically healthy, what are the odds that your LDL actually goes up alongside getting more metabolically healthy? Obviously, what diet you're on is very relevant. I don't think whether it's meat-based or plant-based, specifically like the animal product association is as relevant as whether or not it is, for example, higher in fiber. If it's higher in fiber, this puts more demand on the gut to actually pull out more cholesterol for your bile acids. So that tends to bring up LDL receptors in the liver in case you're trying to increase clearance that way. If it results in higher insulin area under the curve, you can actually reduce your LDL by just being more hyperinsulinemic, but I don't know that I would recommend that specifically. But another one is that you can do more resistance training. And I would posit a big part of that is that quite literally your muscle tissue are taking up more of the LDL particles through a process known as endocytosis, where it's quite literally like they're eating more of them so that they can incorporate them into their own bilayer. You know how I just mentioned earlier how our cells are made of cholesterol. Well, you can put demand on your cells to pick up more of that cholesterol indefinitely through, like things like weight training, for example.
Mm. Let's get into that. I want to definitely touch on that because, making your body metabolically more healthy, you can't do that as effective in any other way in terms of types of exercise than you can with strength training, right? So I'm glad you really brought that up. But I'd like to go into the science, like you mentioned there, right? And I know you mentioned ApoB. What is it that people need to look out for? And I'd love to, not to go off topic too much. I actually read Dr. Peter Attia's book, right? Outlive.
Mm-hmm.
And I've found it interesting. He mentioned that a lot in there. And, a lot of it I liked, and I could see, obviously you agree with a lot of stuff he says, and, a lot of it is research based, but it's a very complex topic, right? So yeah, talk to us a bit more about the science, the ins and outs, in a nutshell. And you mentioned ApoB as well, and what kind of things people should really look out for when you go into the nuance and the weeds, if you like, of LDL and cholesterol in general.
Yes, so let me unpack all of those at the same time. First of all, ApoB is the major protein that are on these lipoproteins that I was talking about. So it's an apolipoprotein is what it's called, and it kind of wraps around the proteins themselves. If you ever look at a picture of a lipoprotein, it tends to have these snaky bumps on them. Those are the proteins, the apoproteins that are around it. And ApoB is the largest one. And every lipoprotein that's part of this class will have exactly one of them. So the VLDL that I mentioned that leaves the liver, it has an ApoB. When it remodels to an LDL from dropping off its cargo, that ApoB lipoprotein will stay with it all the way until it's taken back up again. So what Dr. Attia would say is ApoB is a better measurement than LDL because it's picking up all atherogenic lipoproteins. Now, I don't know if you knew this. I've actually been on Tia's podcast very early on. I want to say it was in 2018. And we had kind of a bit of a debate. It went for like 3.5 hours. It gets a bit into the weeds, and it was very interesting. Um, and since that's happened, I've both published the papers, including the lipid energy model, and we now have this study that's out of Lundquist, where we're actually looking at this risk specifically with this group of individuals like myself who tend to have not just high LDL, but high HDL, low triglycerides. And this is where there's kind of a bit of a disagreement that I may have with Dr. Attia that I think can best be summarized by bringing it back to what I was describing before with the physiology. So with people like myself in this phenotype I would call lean mass hyperresponders, which I'm sure you've heard of by now, but for your audience, it's literally defined by those three things: an LDL of 200 or higher, an HDL of 80 or higher, and triglycerides of 70 or lower. Those three define a lean mass hyperresponder. Our study is around lean mass hyperresponders. And why this is important is why they have a higher LDL, I would argue, is a different context for why other people may have a high LDL and also a higher ApoB. So if ApoB lipoproteins as a class are delivering these lipids, so VLDL is an ApoB lipoprotein, LDL is the lipoprotein it remodels into from either delivering lipids or failing to deliver lipids, then that becomes a relevant clue. Because yes, I would expect that somebody who's metabolically unhealthy would have higher levels of ApoB lipoproteins. Why? Because unlike rapid turnover from being fat adapted, like we see with lean mass hyperresponders, they're having more of a traffic jam. They're failing to deliver those lipids. And therefore, you're seeing a higher total number of those vehicles that are trying to achieve that, that are trying to deliver it. So I do agree that a higher concentration of ApoB will likely associate with greater cardiovascular disease. The question is the why? Is it because of this traffic jam associated with metabolic syndrome, with having nowhere to park these triglycerides and therefore more of it's backing up into the bloodstream, versus how much these lipoproteins themselves are independently atherogenic? That, I think, is an important question to answer. And the only way we could do it was, it may not be the only way, but I would argue the easiest way we could do it was to study lean mass hyperresponders, because they have high LDL and therefore high ApoB. But what I would argue is for the opposite reason, because they're successfully delivering their cargo in their bloodstream. It's not from a traffic jam. They're actually rapidly turning it over. And therefore, if ApoB lipoproteins are independently atherogenic, then it should be absolutely rampant with lean mass hyperresponders.
And just define a lean mass hyperresponder for the audience.
Again, LDL cholesterol of 200 milligrams per deciliter or higher, HDL cholesterol of 80 milligrams per deciliter or higher, and triglycerides of 70 milligrams per deciliter or lower. And I'll restate what I said before, because it helps a lot of people. I know this stuff gets complicated, but why do I believe it works that way? Well, because somebody who's lean and metabolically healthy, they go on a very low carb diet, they become fat adapted. Well, now they need to traffic those fatty acids around their body at a faster rate. So since more fat is now leaving their fat cells at a greater rate, they need to be repleted at a greater rate. They need to be brought back in bulk to a greater rate. Also, if they're being powered more, if their skeletal muscle, especially their cardiac muscle, is being powered more by fat, then it helps to get them into these major carriers like lipoproteins. But that corresponds with faster turnover. So while LDL gets higher because of the greater turnover, and ApoB gets higher because there's more of the vehicles, also triglycerides get lower because even though you're powered by triglycerides, the turnover is faster. So just like with glucose, it's going down. And importantly, HDL is higher because it's a proxy for the turnover. It's showing this faster and faster rate of turnover. And that's why, by the way, we see with lean mass hyperresponders, my good friend and colleague, Nick Norwitz, for example, has much higher HDL cholesterol than I do. He also has much higher LDL cholesterol than I do. And guess what? He's way more athletic than I am. He's leaner, he's more athletic, so he's pulling harder at those levers that increase this triad by comparison between the two of us. And that would be predicted by the lipid energy model.
So interesting. You broke it down really well. And I think a lot of people really overcomplicate things as well. And, people listening to this, you've broken it down in such a simple way. But the reality is, if you can get metabolically healthy, as you say, and you can focus on the simple things, which are really simple and actually kind of boring when you say it, right? It's like, move, do strength training. We can get into this, eat mainly whole foods, primarily whole foods, single ingredient foods. Like, I never see people going wrong with that. And again, I'm glad you cleared this up, because everyone I know who's super healthy, not just a little bit healthy, but like machines, basically, their LDL is, slightly elevated. But what I wanted to touch on as well is something relating to, cholesterol being a steroid hormone as well, right? Now, when it comes to what I've noticed myself is when I lift heavier weights and I go through like a strength training phase where I'm doing lower reps, heavier weights, trying to build muscle and get stronger, it's an absolute noticeable difference when I consciously increase dietary cholesterol by eating more egg yolks. I don't actually eat egg whites because they mess my stomach up anyway. But to be honest, every day on average, I'll eat about eight egg yolks. You know what I mean? And I'll throw in some beef liver as well, which is a good source of cholesterol. And I get a noticeable difference, not just in strength, but a little bit with libido as well. So there's obviously something going on there as well with, cholesterol and increasing dietary cholesterol acting as like a steroid hormone in the body, right?
This is an interesting question, because while I don't touch as much on the endocrinology aspect of it, um, I have had this hypothesis for some time, and I know it's extremely controversial. So let me just reiterate. It's a hypothesis. What is often claimed is that our body will make all the cholesterol it needs. That's a very common claim. And I'm not so much disputing whether or not we can make cholesterol. That's just a fact. All of our cells, almost all of our cells, can make their own, synthesize their own cholesterol. But just like anything else that gets made, there's a cost to it. Well, I'm sure you're very familiar with amino acids, particularly if you're doing a lot of building. You need to be very aware that there's essential amino acids which you must get from outside the body as a diet. There's non-essential amino acids, but then there's an interesting category called conditionally essential amino acids, right? So under certain conditions, they become essential. You're not going to make them to the same degree. I believe cholesterol may ultimately be found to be a conditionally essential molecule for the body. In other words, it may well be that given certain conditions, you really will never need to make it, that somebody could be plant-based for their entire life and avoid animal products, and they're perfectly fine. This wouldn't surprise me at all. But on the other end of it, I think it's possible, and I think we've kind of possibly seen examples in real time. For example, there's a number of people who have attempted to do a plant-based diet and has succeeded at doing it for decades, and were very all in on it, and then had just an absolute like they just simply couldn't not eat animal products. They would see something like a steak and it would be so meaningful for them. And then once they had it, they felt like they were meeting some nutrient deficiency. Now, I don't know if this is cholesterol in particular, but it wouldn't surprise me if that's one of the complement of things that was actually desired for that individual in that case that we ultimately find out. I don't know, but it wouldn't surprise me because of how greedy the body is with cholesterol. It takes over 30 steps to make it in the malevolent pathway, and it's a lot of work. It's very expensive. And it takes a lot of components to accomplish its synthesis, such that it would not surprise me if the body at a certain point is saying, "Look, I need you to meet the demand for me externally with your diet."
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I agree with you on that. And again, you said it's a hypothesis, but it's so complex, right? And when it comes to the research and everything else, it's always going to evolve. And it wouldn't surprise me if what you're saying is proven at some point anyway, to be honest, because it just kind of makes sense to me. But with people in terms of nutrition, right, and dietary cholesterol, we're on that topic now of, does dietary cholesterol have an impact on, for example, your blood lipid levels, right? So eating an egg yolk, for example, it's nature's multivitamin, in my opinion, right? Well, not in my opinion, it is, right? Because you look at the bioavailable nutrients in an egg yolk and the vitamins and the fats and amino acids as we talked about then. Um, People then think, okay, my LDL is a bit high, I better cut back on eating eggs, right? I've had this battle with clients in the past on, one of the most whole foods known to man. I'm going to start cutting back on them, right? So what's your thoughts on just nutrition in general? Because we do know that when it comes to, heart disease, well, I guess we could tie this in here and plaque building up around the heart, in the presence of inflammation, maybe having certain blood markers, which are high, or lipids in particular, could be a problem. But anyway, I'm kind of going off on a tangent here. Let's just stick with the one thing: nutrition and dietary cholesterol, and just basically foods in general, whether that be processed foods. Do these things play a part in, the blood lipid levels, triglycerides, and cholesterol levels? And could that, because metabolic health, though, I think when people eat excess calories and eat more food than they need, a lot of these things become a bigger problem, right? So I know there's a lot of context, but just in general, do you have any kind of answers for us on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll concede up front that given where I'm at this point in this research journey, I put much, much, much less stock on a kind of linear relationship with dietary cholesterol and resulting lipid levels in the blood. I so first of all, most of what you're consuming when you have cholesterol in the diet are cholesterol esters. And cholesterol esters means that the cholesterol molecule has esterified to it fatty acids, and it's kind of big and it's bulky, and most of that will pass through you. The other cholesterol is free cholesterol, and that's the molecule all by itself that you will typically absorb. But your liver will up-regulate production of cholesterol, endogenous cholesterol, if you have less of it in the diet, and it'll downregulate synthesis of cholesterol if you have more in the diet because you're absorbing more. So there's this like counterbalancing thing that's going on. I believe that much of the cholesterol, the standing levels of cholesterol in the blood, have more levers to them that are affecting it than literally dietary cholesterol itself. And I think the evidence kind of backs this up to the point where like I hardly even pay attention to it. I think it's true that if you have very little cholesterol in your diet and you add some foods with cholesterol, you will see more appear. But again, this may come back around to the potential conditional deficiency if extraordinarily low and if not as successful at the synthesis site. Again, all of this is hypothesis based, but the standing levels of cholesterol in the blood with regard to dietary cholesterol, there are a lot of studies around that.
And let's talk about heart disease, Dave, and all of the stuff that has been talked about over the years, and why, cholesterol and saturated fat have been demonized over the years. And then obviously when we look at the processed foods, for example, right, when the ultra processed foods started coming on the market, I think it was back in the 70s, and people started eating more food, you can see the rates of heart disease and chronic illness just slowly rise. But obviously we've been told over the years that it's cholesterol and saturated fat you need to avoid, otherwise you're going to get heart disease. And even to this day, and luckily people now are getting wiser, a lot of people, and they're understanding that actually, red meat is pretty good to eat if it's good quality. I haven't got to worry too much about eating eggs. I don't think that's kind of the least of my worries now. Most of my clients are aware of that. But yeah, where does that come from? And is this something people need to be aware of in terms of, heart disease and saturated fats and stuff?
Yeah, so first, full disclosure, I'm always very cautious on the should I and what should we worry about, that kinds of. But I will state things with regard to where we're at right now with the data and why it is that I've made the personal choices I have. So as I just mentioned earlier in the interview, my LDL is floating around 250 to 270. Uh, for some perspective, that's in the top 10% of the top 1% of the general population. So certainly under typical circumstances, a doctor would not let me leave their office without insisting I be on at least two medications to attack and lower my LDL as much as possible. My diet is certainly rich in saturated fat. I eat a lot of red meat. I have a lot of animal protein, which I hear regularly should be associated with heart disease. And getting back to fiber, my diet tends to be low on fiber. Well, this is part of why I wanted to initiate the research that we're doing at the Lundquist Institute, which we've now completed. I just briefly stated it's a longitudinal study. We got 100 lean mass hyperresponders or nearly lean mass hyperresponders. They all have that triad, and got a scan at day 0, and then got a second scan about 365 days later. We wanted to find out at a population level if they would have a rapid progression of non-calcified plaque, which is what would be expected if they have very high levels of LDL. I haven't seen the final analysis, but we have done a recent match comparison against people who have an average level of LDL. So they're like right in the middle, whereas ours are like me, actually. I think the average LDL is 272 in this match analysis with the participants we have. And while it's preliminary, while it's just the first step, etc., this is the first data of its kind in that we're literally targeting people who are metabolically healthy. And there, in this match analysis, there is statistically no difference in the plaque of our group versus Miami Heart, which is the group that it got matched with. In fact, it's actually trending in the other direction. Again, statistically insignificant, but not trending toward higher plaque. It's actually trending toward lower plaque by comparison with Miami Heart. But again, I'll caveat, it's just the first step. We have more data to go. But that kind of met with sort of what my hypothesis is as it stands today, which is that I actually think that we haven't fully accounted for how much high LDL associates with cardiovascular disease in the context of this poor metabolic health and how it can be a passenger as opposed to a driver, right? This is why we needed to study these folks to find that out. And to bring it back to diet, I don't know yet what our participants' diet is, but given the lean mass hyperresponder population, odds are they, like me, probably have diets very high in saturated fat, low in fiber, et cetera. We have food frequency questionnaires that we'll be checking in on, not for the accuracy of the calories and so forth, but just at least for their diet composition.
Yeah, and when you look at things as well, again, it's very complex, but also it's kind of simple when you look at people who are eating whole foods like yourself, probably quite high protein as well, blunt your appetite, you feel satiated. It's the natural signals that we're getting to tell you when you're full, when you're eating good quality foods, essential nutrients as well, right? Like essential proteins and fats, which you'd literally die without, right? If you didn't get them in, like we touched on earlier with amino acids and everything else. But then you look at people who are eating, overeating, and really the ultra processed foods always comes down to this. And I'm like a broken record because I say this on every podcast, but they're designed to make us overeat, right? I think it was done here in Sydney. I don't know if you saw that study where they had two groups, one group eating whole foods, one group eating unlimited access to ultra processed foods. One group was whole foods, unlimited access. And it was a cross study as well. So they crossed the groups over because of the variance from person to person. The same thing happened basically. They ate 500 calories more per day by having unlimited. And the macros and calories, the macros are roughly, I don't know how they done it, but it was a pretty good study. And yeah, so 500 calories more a day. So when you look at metabolic health, it's obviously very important, right? If you're carrying more fat around the internal organs as well, right, Dave? And there's so many factors as well, right? Because there's so much context. You look at the person who's overweight and, maybe gaining weight every year, like the average person, and they're generally not doing the other habits that other people are doing, like moving enough, maybe too much ultra processed foods. Well, definitely most of the time, which is causing people to overeat. Not enough protein, which blunts your appetite, and then probably not doing strength training as well, right? And then what about the sleep? Most people are sleep deprived. There's so many factors, right, Dave?
Yeah, and I'm glad you're bringing this up because this is, one of the challenges that I have in working with my own family, because I don't have clients like you and many others that I work with do, but I do have family that I'm concerned about. And I think it's wired, it's in our human nature to be like, oh, here's this problem that's a very concerning problem. Oh, good. There's a simple answer to that problem. There's a simple solution. And the solution to having that problem is to reduce the exposure of this particular thing. And hey, there's a drug to reduce the exposure of that particular thing. When in reality, we have mountains and mountains of data that show indeed your metabolic health is far more relevant than LDL cholesterol towards cardiovascular disease. You don't even need to have a strong opinion on how much LDL causes or does not cause cardiovascular disease, you should have a strong opinion on how metabolic health affects cardiovascular disease because the data is so overwhelming. So yes, if the food you're consuming is coming from, I bring this up a lot because I find a lot of times people in the keto world feel like if they just dial in the macros because they probably heard it in a talk, then everything just works out, right? And as somebody who is on a low carb diet, I do find it helps manage my appetite, my weight better, but there's still problem keto foods. And they do tend to be packaged foods. They do tend to be processed. And so on an individual level, I know there's some foods that could be in my dad's pantry, can't be in my pantry. They just can't be there, or I'm going to overconsume them, right? And to the degree with which they are the nature of how the food was processed, or in some cases where the food is related to childhood memories that I appreciate, for example, where it was a self-soothing device. All of these are factors that can result in me having poor eating habits. So yes, I wish it were as simple as going, oh, I need to keep my carbs down to X amount and then everything's fine, right? And then I can eat anything I want. No, no. Things like nutrient density matters. Things like getting back to amino acids. You can't just eat something that says it's high in protein. You actually need some kinds of amino acids more than others, probably, if you're not having animal protein, for example. So it's fine. You can make it work, but you have to work at it, right? And yes, I don't care what diet you're trying to dial in. It's difficult when food companies, their job is to try to find the tastiest and strongest bliss point for you to continue to consume. And they've got a lot of time and effort that's put into it that when in reality, our ancestral makeup, our machine, this is where the engineer in me loves it. We have layered code, right? We have legacy code, you would call it, where we worked against an environment that we were used to, and we have millions of years applied to it. So that ancestral diet is something we've had practice with, which tends to be protein, fat, and fibrous carbs. And more recently, we've come up with a whole new environment. And round the clock food, which wasn't we've had problems with famine and many variations of famine. We've not had a problem with round the clock availability of food. That's brand new, right?
100%.
So yeah, you take all these into account and you're right. It's a lot of factors, and I wish more people had that appreciation for it.
100%, 100%. There's a lot of factors, but again, when you simplify everything, it's exactly what you just touched on then. The quality of food you're eating is really important. And I see this time and time again, Dave, because I have a lot of people come through and reach out to me through the carnivore space. I've done collaborations with the likes of, Anthony Chafee and all those kind of people, Sean Baker, and they come through and they reach out for coaching, and they've basically gained a lot of weight. They've switched over carnivore. They've had some success initially because they've gone eating more whole foods and more protein, right? So it's blunted their appetite and less of the ultra processed foods. And then over time, they've gained weight. And it's an interesting one because they say, because fats, right? If you look at fats in terms of consuming fats from your food, there's like 9 calories in a gram of fat, right? So there's more calories in a gram of fat, actually over double than what there is even in a gram of carbs, right? In a gram of carbs, there's 4 calories. So people gain weight. But then when I unpack things, I see this stuff which they weren't aware of, like, again, things coming out of a packet, maybe on the weekends. So yeah, you're eating more fat. But what happened is you switched over to a whole food diet, basically, carnivore, more protein as well. And then after about 4 or 5 weeks, those old behaviors, because this is what you're touching on now, right? It's not as simple as just having calories and macros. That's very surface level. It can be great to have that awareness. I think there's a lot of value in it, but it goes way deeper into the behaviors. And then what's happened, maybe you followed a certain diet, carnivore, for 4 or 5 weeks, maybe longer, and you've done really well. You've had some success. And then what's happened is those old behaviors have just crept back in on the weekends because you've probably gone from one extreme to another. Yeah. This one happens a lot. And then, okay, and then they think they've gained weight because of, eating more fats. And there's some truth in that. But what's happened is the excess calories from the processed foods, which are creeping in on the weekend, right? How much of that were you having as well on top of that? So, it's an interesting topic, but again, for me, all the patterns I see always come back to the same things. When I look at my clients who eat at least 90%, say real food, mainly single ingredient foods, They have no problem hitting their protein target. So they're having quite high protein, probably 30-40% of their calories are coming from protein. And they don't seem to have any issues, you know?
Yeah, I think there's another component too, which is that I think we all think that we're going to be more adherent to the diet we intend to be on. I think that diet is not only personal, but it's also it's a means of self-soothing. So you know, you hear it all the time, I'm sure. "Ah, I was exhausted and I just wanted to relax, right? And it's effectively an excuse to I want to exit the commitment I've made to the foods that I'm going to consume and allow myself a quote unquote cheat. And cheat only in the case of food is something we've decided to make a little bit more socially acceptable. But at the end of the day, we don't do this with other things. We don't do this with alcoholism. We don't do this with smoking. It's like you've been doing so good with having quit smoking. Go ahead and, cut loose and let yourself have a cigarette just this one weekend, or a pack, whatever, right? It's no, no, no. Maintaining adherence to something that you consider to be very valuable for health and for your longevity, not just for you, but for your family and so forth, is a commitment worth considering. That said, the difference is we still need to eat. So the needing to eat ends up becoming a means by which we can keep funneling it towards whether we want to do that self-soothing behavior. So to your point, I have a lot of friends, I have a lot of family that are like, oh yeah, you know what? I'm going keto and I'm not turning back. Or I have some friends that are like, I'm going plant-based from now on. I saw that documentary. Now I'm just going to be vegan 24/7. And I always say the same thing to everyone, which is I'm like, just be mindful of what you think you can continue to maintain. That's still an improvement. Because what you can do also is you can burn yourself out real quickly. You can, go hardcore into the thing you do, and then you make it such an all or nothing that you binge out of the diet and then you never come back. And then you're like, I tried the diet, it doesn't work for me. It's like, well, you didn't try a version that could work for you. You you kind of sabotage yourself by making it an all or nothing.
100%. And that's where most people fail. I'm glad you brought that up because you're trying an approach which is definitely too extreme. It's not sustainable for most 99% of people. Let's be honest, keto diet, they're just not going to stick to it because they're going from one extreme to another, just like you said, right? And that
It
approach,
depends on the reason they took it on. So
yeah, that's
I'll
really important.
caveat.
Yeah.
I'll caveat. I know some people who've taken it on for health reasons. My good friend and collaborator Nick Norwitz, for example, it's to fix his ulcerative colitis. He would love to be able to not be on keto. He'd love to be able to eat more carbs and that kind of stuff. I know epileptics, who it's like a no-brainer. Jen Unwin, who we interviewed for a documentary. We're doing a documentary right now on the whole study and so forth. She has to do it to manage her eating disorder, which is very open about, right? But it's because it's to achieve the success of something. That said, to your point, do I think a lot of people are like, oh, I just want to try this out. I want to feel what it's like to be in ketosis, and then they have kind of a honeymoon phase. Uh, like me, I think I bounce between keto and low carb. I'm rarely in a very lengthy stretch of just keto, but that's because it is. You really have to stay on it. Like you can't conflate the two. You can't conflate keto with just low carb in general. Low carb being like, say, between 20 and 30 carbs to 120 carbs. That's actually pretty easy to achieve, pretty easily. To stay under 20 carbs or under 30 carbs, especially total carbs, you're usually very mindful in attacking it. Like you're really mindful of doing it. You're good in social situations about not eating any food that might have those carbs, even if it's like hors d'oeuvres or whatever. That's a certain kind of person. That's usually, not always, but that's often people like what I was talking about in the first category. They have a particular reason to be on a ketogenic diet. And a lot of times that's to manage a medical condition.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because it's really clear the data right on certain conditions is absolutely unbelievable what the keto diet can do. And I feel it as well when I switch into I don't do it full transparency. I eat carbs like most days, right? I eat mainly fruit, but I do notice a massive. If I want to be more productive, sharper, not spend any time and energy thinking about food, because even what I find is I used to struggle with binge eating because I used to do bodybuilding, Dave, in the past. And it's funny what you said then about cheat meals, because I actually just did a like part of the previous podcast was on that. And people, and when I used to kind of have that mindset for about 2 years, it was where I used to cheat on the weekends, quote unquote. Firstly, my thing is, why are you calling it a cheat, right? There's never any benefit to
Mm,
that. So you're telling yourself you're
mhm.
cheating. What's that going to follow with? And what you said then is so interesting, but it's true about you never do that with alcohol, with cigarettes.
Right.
I've never thought of it that way. But you're saying that word, and then obviously you're going to feel guilty afterwards, and there's just no benefit. And people call it a treat, right? But reality, is it really a treat? But again, being realistic and having a bit of balance there is okay. For the most part, you are making improvements. And I think that is the most important thing people need to look at. People want the quick fix. And I get it. Humans are wired to take the easy route. We all are, right? But it's not a quick fix. And like my approach with clients is always adding in what they're missing. A lot of times, depending on the client, most people are at a decent level that I take on, but they might need to get to optimal protein levels from maybe adequate to get the result they want. But the average person, literally, if they could start eating more, in my opinion, just more good quality sources of meat and more protein, that would fix a lot of things, right? Because it blunts your appetite. But again, it's not a one answer for everyone. But I like to touch on, Dave, what you touched on earlier was strength training and resistance training. Really important, right? And the research on this is blowing my mind. I've been talking about these things forever. The effects on metabolism that I notice with clients is insane. Just from doing strength training, the research shows, 1 pound of fat, 1 pound of lean muscle will burn like 6 to 13 calories, but that's not the truth because there's Dr. Gabrielle Lyon's been doing some research on this. It's actually very complex when you're trying to track that. But I notice with clients, it's more like 50 calories. This is every month, 50 calories to sometimes 100 calories more their body's burning just by doing strength training and actually having a bit more protein, for example, right? That's a lot, you know?
Yeah, and for what it's in full disclosure, like I said, with Nick being more athletic than I am, I tend to not be. I want to say that the periods of time in my life where I tended to be more athletic was, for example, with the running, which I mentioned a little bit earlier. But I actually don't do as much strength training as I should. But I've managed to get onto Dr. Ben Bokikios, I think is his full name. He does there's literally like I want to say 16 to 20 minute strength training workout with a total body gym, um, total body gym, total gym, whatever it's called. And it's like the plank thing where you just like switch out the different things and you do it to failure. That I have to say has been a game changer for me because it's been something I've been able to do 2 to 3 times a week, without question. If I could, and if I were to the level of motivation I should be at, I would do something more like an hour, at least 3 times a week or something like that. But oftentimes I find my I tend to have more time in cardio, and it's not even strong cardio. It's more like brisk walking along with things like this in the rather busy life that I have. But it's the research on strength training that led me to say, I need to do something. And that's what I credit for at least getting me to this point in time, because I do believe it is meaningful. Now, to be sure, we have a bad baseline. Like with a lot of research, when you're grabbing just the average group of Americans, the average group of Europeans, basically Western civilization overall, it's hard to know how much strength training is really this super solution than it is just a deficiency compared to our ancestors, right? In the same way that we could say with whole food. Is it really that whole food itself is like a net benefit, or is it just that it's the detriment that we have with the food-like substances we're consuming instead of whole food, right? I tend to think it's probably more the former, and that's why it's like with strength training. No, I just need to get closer to baseline. And that helps me a little bit more on the motivation side, is that I can't look around at my peers and be like, oh, I'm doing pretty good compared to the average guy my age. It's not good enough. I need to think about what my DNA came up on. And it came up on much more exercise, much more sunlight, as you mentioned earlier, better sleep, which is actually, I think, my biggest weakness right now. I'm not really that great with sleep. Too much stuff I got on my plate, but I'm
Yeah.
working on that.
You're working on that. Great stuff. Great stuff. No, two to
Yeah.
three times a week is solid though. And just for the audience, if you can do 2 to 3 purposeful strength training sessions a week, every week for most of your life, that's a huge win because strength is one of the most important things for longevity, the most important thing, really. And when we talk about muscle being the longevity organ and everything else, but that's another conversation. One more thing I want to wrap this up with, Dave, which I forgot to mention, is just medications. I want to get this out there to the audience. Let's just say someone listening, they go to the doctor, they get their bloods done, their LDL's high, for example, or for whatever reason, the doctor. Look, I know this is a very broad question, but let's just say their LDL levels are high, really high, and the doctor kind of recommends, medication, statins or whatever. Uh, what are your thoughts on, is there any benefit, do you think, for a small percentage of people to taking medications, or do you feel like everything can be reversed based on your lifestyle and decisions and stuff?
You're literally touching on one of the things that I don't comment on. So I generally don't comment on medical use. In fact, I often have this kind of stock answer, which is my research is on the horse and the medication is the cart, right? So the question is, if you do have high LDL and you're metabolically healthy, should you take steps to lower it? Uh, that's the horse, right? And if the answer is yes, you should take steps to lower it, that's the cart. Now the how, which might come around to medication. What I will say is I will say that in the lean mass hyperresponder community, which now we have a Facebook group, it's 11,500. We're very proud of that group because there's a wide spectrum of opinions there. So some people are comfortable with their high LDL, some are not comfortable with their high LDL, some debate it actively, and I think that's all good. It's healthy, right? Your decision is your own and should be respected as such. For those that choose to lower their LDL, the most popular of lean mass hyperresponders of interventions tends to be enzetamide, which is cholesterol absorption lowering. That tends to be the most popular, but that by no means is the only one. Some do take on statins, some do not. Uh, some, have journeys where they kind of come in and out of it. Um, it's a variety, but it's not for me to say what you should do one way or another, but it is for me to try to get this research in front of everyone. So that's what we're doing now.
Awesome stuff. Love it. And one little bit of, I guess, advice I want to give you, right, is with the sleep. Aura ring. I thought you had an
Yeah.
aura ring on earlier. I know some people are kind of a bit kind of, oh, the radiation and everything else. Trust me, as a trade-off, the aura ring for me has been absolutely life-changing in terms of, and again, it's not going to be bang on accurate with the stats, but again, once you're aware of it, because I know obviously you're, a go-getter, you'll see the stats and you'll go, well, I'm gonna level this sleep up. You know what I mean? So aura ring, and I've got no affiliation with them or anything like that, but yeah, something I've got a lot of value from. What are your thoughts on like the sleep trackers and stuff like that? Is that something you've ever thought about? Or
My favorite one is my aura ring.
oh, you've got the aura
It's
ring. I thought it was the aura ring, but I was like, but then you mentioned
yeah,
sleep, so you're aware of it. Okay, so you're aware of
yeah.
it, and you're like, oh, okay, because
Oh
of
yeah. And I highly recommend it's funny because a lot of the features in the Oura Ring I don't put as much stock in. For example, I'm not sure how much I agree with some of its metrics, given my own like testing independently of other things. But its sleep tracking is really impressive. Like I've been blown away at how accurate it is. And of course, it's also what sort of helps to reinforce how I need to get better at it. Um, there's a common term we have in engineering, which is if you can't measure it, you can't manage it.
yeah, I know what
So
you're saying.
as a somebody who's taking your health on, get to where you're capturing more of the data around it, and it will tell you more, and many times can be more motivating than what anyone else can tell you because it's you. It's not, it's a there's this term I have for my family that I like a lot. If I were a doctor, I'd probably say it a lot too, which is when they go, "Hey, no, I've been doing good on my diet. I've been doing this and this and this and this." And I say, "Don't convince me, convince your blood work." Because if your blood work comes back and it's telling me your insulin's a lot higher, your glucose is a lot higher, hey, that's not on me. You can't talk me out of having the blood work you have. So just like with sleep, I can't I can't talk to myself in the mirror. I can't talk to my loved ones. I can't be like, I'm doing better on sleep. No, if the Oura Ring's not telling me better, then that's where I take steps and I try to do more about it.
Love it. Yeah, I think it's awesome as well, the sleep tracker. And I like just the HRV, just keeping an eye on HRV. And the research is interesting on that now as well, in terms of lower HRVs potentially being a bit more stress on the body. But I do notice if I'm run down or whatever, my HRV drops. And when I'm feeling, again, there can be a lot of placebo there as well, but I just keep an eye on the HRV and the sleep tracker. And I think it's great just for that awareness, right? But look, Dave, we're going to wrap this up here. That was literally so much valuable advice and content. I want to say advice, just content and information there for the audience, and advice. Where can we find you? And if there's anything you want to mention for the audience, let us know.
Sure. I mean, we didn't talk about it here, but the study that we're doing this through is the Citizen Science Foundation. It is a bona fide public charity. So if you want to help support this research, of course, I want to do a mention that you can contribute directly to us, but also we have a fundraiser that we did this year. We're going to do it again next year. That's basically a conference. I like to say it's a fundraiser dressed in a conference, right? And that'll be at the first weekend of February next year. It's called Collaborative Science Conference, or COSI. You can just go to cosci.org, then and come visit us. I'm also active on X/Twitter as Real Dave Feldman, and yeah, outside of that, I hope that we have a lot more research to share pretty soon. I think we will, as the final analysis is getting worked on right now, and hopefully that'll get us some more data.
Awesome. I will share your links and everything anyway in the show notes. And thanks again for your time, man. I really enjoyed that conversation, Dave.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on.
Pleasure.